Club Business Series and Olin's very own Bauer Leadership Center. And I appreciate you being here to support your school and the 2021 Distinguished Alumni Award honorees. Today is, I guess, a little bittersweet because we would really love to be celebrating our honorees in person, of course. However, we nevertheless are still thrilled and delighted to be able to celebrate them virtually here with all of you. And of course, we're looking forward to tonight's celebration of our Distinguished Alumni honorees, and we certainly hope to see all of you again this evening, where today's panelists will be formally recognized for their accomplishments. So on our panel this morning, we have 4 outstanding executives of whom the school is extremely proud, who will share their experiences and knowledge as leaders. Andrew Rubin received his undergraduate degree from Olin in 1998. He's the co-founder and chief executive officer at Illumio. Rob Vitale is a 1994 graduate of Olin's professional MBA program, and he is the chief executive officer at Post Holdings. Eric Veiel graduated with his MBA in 1999, and he's the head of US equity and co-head of global equity at T. Rowe Price. Last, but certainly not least, Kelli Washington received her undergraduate degree from Olin in 1994, and she's the Managing Director of Research and Investment Strategy at the Cleveland Clinic. Leading the discussion today is Professor Stuart Bunderson, Director of the Bauer Leadership Center and the George and Carol Bauer Professor of Organizational Ethics and Governance. The mission of the Bauer Leadership Center is to create knowledge about best practices in values-centered leadership, to educate and inspire the next generation of values-centered leaders, and to transform how businesses think about and practice leadership. So, as you have questions today, please submit them using the Q&A function through Zoom, and Stuart will gladly address these with our panelists at the end of their discussion. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll now hand over to Professor Stuart Bunderson.
Thank you, Dean Taylor, and good morning, everyone. Special welcome to our panelists who are joining us here this morning. I know that for at least one of our panelists, this is a very early morning, and so we very much appreciate them taking the time. First off, let me just add my congratulations to each of our distinguished panelists for this recognition. I think, as all of you know who are joining today, we have a very impressive group of alumni. And so to be recognized as standing out for your accomplishments and for your contributions, I think is something very special. So let me, and looking at this group, it's clear that it's very well deserved. So I just wanted to add my congratulations. Our goal today in this session is to reflect on something that is truly important to us at Olin, and something we think about all the time, and that is, how do we prepare people to be effective leaders, leaders of impact, leaders of integrity, and leaders who have the competence and the character needed to make a difference in their organizations, in their industries, and in their communities. And so we thought we would take advantage of this distinguished panel of alums to invite a few reflections on that topic, and to invite them to think a little bit about some of the things that they've experienced in their careers that have led to their career path and career trajectory and career success. So that's our goal for today. And we've prepared a few questions to help us guide us through that discussion. But before we do that, I warned each of our panelists actually just a few minutes ago, so they haven't had a lot of time to think about this. But I thought you received a brief introduction just a minute ago from Dean Taylor. And so rather than a formal introduction, I thought it might be fun to invite each of our panelists to just reflect for a minute on a favorite experience from their time at Olin. And we can kind of share that shared history that we all have. So I wonder if I could invite Kelli. Would you like to go first and share a favorite memory?
Yeah, so the one that for me always comes to mind is it was senior year, and I was sitting in the Career Center, like a lot of seniors were at that time, trying to figure out what I was going to do, and just having a conversation with a classmate. And it was someone that I'd been in classes with for 4 years, but had never really had any type of real kind of one-on-one interaction with him. And we just had the best conversation. And that has always stood out for me as a memory of just the type of people that Olin attracts, and the ability to just sit there and talk about, you know, some of it, I'm sure it started with career, and then we branched out into all kinds of other things. And I can't tell you specifically what it was, but that's a memory that just always really has sat with me, that was just a really great experience. And so one of the things I appreciate about Olin and WashU in general is just the people that it attracts. And many of those folks are still some of my best friends in the world. So it was just a great experience.
Okay, I love that story, Kelly. Although, you know, obviously all the faculty members would love to, if all your stories were about this amazing insight you had in class. But the reality is most of the memories tend to be about other students, and which is great. And that's, people have these connections that they make here at Olin, and those are life changing. And so, yeah, thank you. Rob, how about you?
Yeah, I have a lingering memory that is kind of painful and fortunate at the same time. It was a marketing class, and I came out of a finance background, and in my team we had mostly finance and engineering types, and we had to put together a mock advertisement. And many of you may not even remember these things, but back then what we were doing was drawing on, I think they were called acetylene or something, that you put them on an overhead projector and tried to make sure they were upside down or not upside down. Yes. And we went last to be preceded by people who had done these beautiful advertisements on something now called PowerPoint. And our content was okay, but the presentation looked like we were selling Model Ts in an age of space machines. And it taught me that I think maybe I should pay attention to this technology stuff.
Okay, that's great. And I would point out, I mean, as Dean Taylor just said a minute ago, I think one of you graduated in '98 and everyone else was before that. And so, you know, a lot has happened technology-wise in that time frame. So thank you. Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it was, I'd say the highlight memory was winning the Olin Cup, but the one that stands out most profoundly was the begging and pleading and groveling I had to do in Professor Russ Roberts' office to get into the class that was the Olin Cup at the time. And I say that, and I know it sounds like I'm joking, but there really was a lot of groveling involved, because at the time, the Olin Cup wasn't really targeted towards undergraduate students, which I was. It was really for MBA only. And I went to him and I pleaded with him and said, this is something I want to do very badly. And I actually really believe it's sort of the memory of sitting in his office is probably the most distinctive one, and the one with the longest tail on it, still sitting here today. It really is. Unfortunately, he gave me permission to participate. It ended up being life-changing, and winning was certainly the best memory, but getting in was the one that stands out most strongly.
Oh, that's powerful. Life-changing and program-changing, because I mean, you demonstrated that undergraduates can obviously excel in that. So wonderful. And finally, Eric, how about you?
All right, well, I tried to think of something school-related at first, because the first memory that jumped to mind was the Olin Follies, which were, at the end of the MBA second year, really kind of just letting it out. We did I thought, an excellent show, Saturday Night Live based, and it was the only time that I've ever gotten to play guitar in front of any larger group than just 2 or 3 people. And if you've heard me play guitar, you understand why that is, but it was the chance that I had to do it. The other memory that just is literally seared in my brain is when our options professor, Dr. Zhao, walked in the first day of class, opened up the book, and flames literally burst out of it. It was his little prop to get us excited about the class. And it obviously had a memory lasting effect, because 20 plus years later, I still remember the smell of that book burning in the class.
Wow, that's great. Gonna have to remember that one. Well, those are wonderful. And it's one of these things when we're on Zoom, I wish we had the opportunity, all of us, to be in the room together and share some of these memories. But thank you for taking a minute to reflect on some of those the human side of being here at Olin. Well, let's move to some of these questions. and I shared these questions with our panelists before, and so they know what we're going to talk about here today, and had a little bit of a chance to think about these. But the first question is really about this, something that we've been thinking centrally about here at Olin recently, and that's the connection between values and data. So at Olin, we're working to develop leaders who are both values-based and data-driven. So we want people who can look at the data clearly and unflinchingly and in a sophisticated and thoughtful way, and make decisions that are data-based. At the same time, we want to develop leaders who are making decisions from a clear set of values and an understanding of what those values, their values and social responsibilities are. So I'd love to invite each of our panelists to reflect on, in your experience, how important are values and data and the balance between those for effective leadership. And if you have any experiences about how you have achieved a balance between those, we'd love to hear that. I think that would be helpful for all of us and our current and future students. So Andrew, I wonder if you could start us off.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And when I got the questions and I saw that first one, I was thinking, well, this is about as timely and relevant as anything could be, because we talk about this all the time, and I talk about it probably more with my head of people than anybody else in the company. But it is a really interesting time right now in terms of being a leader, and it doesn't have to be a CEO, anybody who's in a leadership position inside of an organization. I think we're being asked, and in some ways we're being challenged, to balance essentially what used to be essentially running a department, a team, a company, with trying to also be a leader in ways that have nothing at all to do with that job in the past. And it includes everything from societal issues to political issues to obviously people issues. And the way that we've tried to frame it up at Illumio as best we can is we think of our values as a framework, and we talk about them very openly. We've written them down. We communicate them when people join the team. We make it very clear that the company has a set of cultural norms and a set of values, and we're not willing to step over those lines for anything. At the same time, we also want to run a high-performing organization, and the only way to do that is to have performance management accountability, and it has to be based on data. And so what we try and do is just be very authentic and very transparent with the team about the fact that we are not going to excuse one for the other in either direction. We're going to use our data, we're going to collect it, we're going to analyze it, and we are definitely going to lean on it very heavily. But we're not going to excuse somebody stepping outside of our values or what we've deemed to be the way that we believe the company has to run and the way that people need to treat each other in the process, both internally and externally, in exchange for anything the data tells us. And as long as we're upfront about it, I think you can balance those two things. But I do think that it's sort of the challenge of today is how to be very upfront, very authentic, and very transparent about all of these things, and then not sacrifice one for the other.
I love that. That was very well stated, Andrew. So in that process that you just described, I mean, do you run into times where you say, okay, the data are pointing in one direction, but we're not comfortable going there because we articulated our values? I mean, are there experiences that you can share in that regard?
We have, and I see some nodding going on my screen, so I know I'm not alone in this. It's happened, and usually the most difficult version of it is when it comes to a people-centric issue, especially a team member, when something happens that the data says is good, but for some reason it's in conflict with the company's values. There are other examples as well, obviously. And ultimately, I think you're going to be judged short, medium, and long term on how serious you are and how authentic you are in your values. In other words, it's very easy to excuse things away and say, well, but the data over here says this is really good for the organization, and we'll just let it slide this one time. But unfortunately, your reputation, you know, the old expression about it takes 20 years to build it and 5 minutes to destroy it or tear it down. Your reputation is built on sort of every one of those tiny incremental decisions over time. And so that's why I sort of said, you know, people say transparency and honesty, but I actually like the word authenticity better, because it's sort of in some way an aggregation of all those things, right? And as long as people know you're being authentic and therefore you're going to be transparent, you're going to hold to what you say, you're going to say what you mean and mean what you say. I think that that's how over time you get everybody sort of reading from the same script, which is ultimately the goal. right? You want people to understand all these things sort of as inherently as possible so that there are no surprises.
Thank you, Andrew. That's great. And I think there's a key point in what you said there about how oftentimes where we see the conflict is in kind of those people management issues. And it's so easy to want to compromise. You've got a high performer, and obviously we don't, some of those we can't really talk about, but I think we know, we can think of examples. Kelli, how about you? Would you like to reflect on that same question about values and data?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the data is important, right? And I think, working in a business that requires a lot of data, one of my key things is don't collect data that you're not ultimately going to use, that's not going to allow you to put to work to make better decisions. But often the data will lead you to make a decision that may not be in line with the values. So kind of piggybacking off of what Andrew said, and it's key to understand what the values are so that you are making the right decision. So in my mind, values allow you to filter the data so that you're going to make the right decision. And as I think about a specific instance in my career, when I was, this was my first company out of undergrad, and we were, it's the tech boom, the first tech boom, I should say, and we were trying to decide on some investment opportunities and whether or not they made sense. And ultimately, we felt that they didn't, even though there was, a chance they would make a lot of money for a lot of our investors. At the end of the day, these companies weren't profitable in many cases. And if I called out some of the names today, we know those companies don't exist anymore. And so even though it would have made money for the company, it may have made money short-term for the clients, it wasn't in line with our values. And I think as leaders, part of the reason why I, as a relatively new at that point investor, could make that decision is because those values came down from our leadership team. So I knew that I had the backing of our managing partner at that time to make this decision, to, as a very young analyst, to make that decision that was going to impact the bottom line, because at the end of the day, those are the values that he had articulated. And so as leaders, we have a responsibility to articulate those values so that those that report to us directly and those further down have an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and how the data and the profits align with the values that we hold to be true.
Yeah, I love that. And what's interesting, so you and Eric both spend a lot of time thinking, obviously, about portfolio management and maximizing the value of portfolios. And then you just brought in the reality that those decisions, which are so heavily data-based, and we spend a lot of time in a business school trying to think about how we can be data-based in those evaluations. You're saying, yeah, but you got to think about values, and what an interesting domain. I wonder, Eric, maybe that's, we should go to you now, and I don't know what thoughts you have on that question.
Yeah, well, I think Kelli really said something that resonates, which is, making sure you're collecting and looking at the right data. Because in the end, we manage what we measure, and it's a common cliche, but it's very true. So what we've done very purposefully is aligned our core values, which are the tenets of our culture, which are on every presentation that we all give, and they start very clearly with investment excellence. So the first thing that we're going to measure is our investment performance, but that's the first thing. There are three others that are really important. The next pillar is client first. So we measure our ability to interact well with clients, and we collect data on that in 360 fashion. The next thing that we have as our cultural tenets are a culture of collaboration, collegiality, and trust and mutual respect. Again, we measure that every year in a 360 format. And then the final thing is keeping a long-term horizon. And again, in our portfolio management construct, we can measure that as well. There are a lot of other things that you could measure that we don't build into our core cultural tenets because we think they could lead to bad decisions. And you'll notice one of the things that's not in there is anything about revenue growth or sales growth or anything related to that. If you run an investment business solely focused on that, you're going to make bad decisions. And I can give you an example of where that's come into conflict if you want, Stuart, which is, I think everybody's really familiar with, the very large growth in ESG related strategies. And there's a lot of demand for those coming from endowments, just like WashU's and and many other parts of the market. We've always, as a firm, been hyper-focused on the G, on governance, and we've been actively involved in that for 20 plus years. But really building out our capabilities on the E and the S took some time. When we started on this about 4 years ago, we recognized, looking at the data, that it's a pretty open field. There's really no norms, there's no limits. And if you just go ahead and kind of greenwash, say that you're doing ESG, you could generate a lot of flows, which in our business is sales. We very clearly made the decision not to do that, even though in the short term it had a negative impact on our growth, because we knew it wasn't, to use Andrew's word, which is one that I was going to bring up later, which I really value, it wasn't authentic to who T. Rowe Price is as an investment organization. So we've spent the last 4 years really building out what I think are world-class E and S capabilities, environmental and social. And now we just launched our first global impact strategy, which I think over time, playing the long game, will really benefit us. But it was hard. It would have been really easy to greenwash some strategies and have a bunch of flows at a time when, you know, the active management industry is under some pressure.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Eric. While we're talking about that with both Kelli and Eric, sort of this issue of investment strategy and portfolio management and the role of values there, I wonder, have you found that those issues are becoming more salient and prominent in recent years than they have been in the past? I mean, that's something that Andrew mentioned, is that this issue is becoming particularly timely for him. Are you seeing that in your worlds as well?
Yeah, I am. And I think it's, I think to Eric's point about greenwashing, that's a concern, frankly, that it's, you're definitely seeing more talk of it. Still waiting to see the long-term actions related to it. It's easy to talk about it, and especially in the year that we've had, right? To talk about all that's happened as it relates to society. And so I tend to be pretty cynical, which I think makes me a good investor. But so part of it for me is, where are we going to be in 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now? And the places where you see these things resonating then will again go to show who valued it, who wanted to make a change, whatever that change is. And how they chose to live that out in what they do, or work it out in the case of how you live, how you work professionally, although our work is most of where we spend our time. So I, you know, the cynic in me says, I want to see who's still doing these things in 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And those are the places where I think you'll see the move, the change, and arguably, the data does show that taking these things into consideration do provide stronger profitability. As Eric mentioned, you know, thinking about the governance piece of it, that's huge, right? Again, who's managing, who's leading, and how are they choosing to lead, and by what standards are they leading? And then, you know, you're less likely to run into kind of issues down the line if they've got the core values in place. So.
Would you add anything to that, Eric? From your experience?
I think Kelli said it really well. I mean, the only thing I would add is that, you know, thinking about the data when you're an investor is, I think a lot of people lock in on, you know, financial statement analysis and just the numbers. But as I'm sure Kelli would attest, and as Rob and Andrew would know, having, you know, interacted with our investors, we spend a lot of time on the people part of it. And, you know, we think about it as a partnership, and we want to know who we're investing with. We think about it like owners of a business. And so, you know, our analysts who works with Rob knows Rob really well and has a lot of confidence in him. Our team is just starting to get to know Andrew and building a relationship there over time. And I think that's really important for us as investors. It's a lot more than just the numbers on the page. You've got to really believe in the people and that they have the right incentives.
That's awesome. Okay. Rob, last but not least, let me ask you that same question about values and data in your experience, in your world.
I tend to answer everything these days through the lens of COVID. And, you know, with experience, you begin to value experience more. And I think experience is really pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. So when you get into a situation like COVID, where there is no predicate from which to draw, you're really only left with your values and your data, you know, and using data as somewhat of a proxy for analysis with how to navigate a crisis like that. So when COVID started, we really went back to the basics of, you know, what do we believe in and what can we analyze? And frankly, it was less about data than it was the absence of data. And some of our, in fact, our very first value is to protect each other, to make sure that people come home at the end of the day, because, our employees work in environments where there are causes for concern to their physical safety. But never before had we faced a situation in which that safety was a complete exigency. So what we had to do was balance our primary value of protecting our employees against our obligation to keep supply chains running and food available, and manage that in a significant absence of data upon which we could apply our analytical skills. So in terms of conflict between the things that we believe in and the things that we can analyze, that was probably, well, I hope it is the high point or low point of my career, and that is the defining moment for us all, because it was as challenging an environment in an attempt to reconcile what we valued versus what we had to do, as I've experienced.
Yeah, I've heard that from other executives as well, that nothing has forced these issues to the front more than COVID, that you had to make these decisions, and data, we didn't have the data. So you had to sort of rely on value. So have others had any experiences related to COVID that illustrate that, or that they'd like to share?
Well, I'll add one thing, and obviously as a software company, we don't have the same challenges that Rob talked about in terms of the actual, the actual work that our employees do. But I definitely agree entirely with the lack of data. And one of the ways that we dealt with that was every time we went, or especially the executive team, every time we started to go down the hole of let's predict what's going to happen, I felt like my job was to say, we need to stop doing this because we don't know. There is no previous playbook to pull out of the drawer on this one. We're going to spend hours and hours talking about the what ifs, but none of us have any idea what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone 6 months from now. And I know before we all came on to this webinar, the dean was talking about how this, now with hindsight, this will all be over in a couple of weeks, then a couple of months. And now here we sit 15 months later, most of us in the exact same place we were last March. And so I think one of the things that became almost in a strange way reassuring was to stop trying to predict the future. We didn't know, we didn't have the data, and it was okay to admit that and be very upfront with the entire team about it. So the unknown in this case, the lack of data actually ended up becoming something that we had to get everybody comfortable with, because people are looking for reassurance that there's a playbook and a plan. And this was the one time where there wasn't one.
One thing I would quickly add to that is agree on the lack of data. One of the portfolio managers who I work with basically, about 4 months in, we kind of felt like this is going pretty well. How are we pulling this all off? And he made the point, look, we came into this with a very deep reservoir of cultural goodwill, because we've built that over years and years and years. But every day that we're apart from each other, we're draining that just a little bit. And some days a little more, some days a little less. And now as we sit here 15 months later, we just did a pulse survey on the teams across the whole 7,000 person organization. And in my area, the investment side, what really stood out was work-life balance. The numbers have just like fallen off a cliff in terms of going from what used to be quite good for an intense industry to just terrible. And the reality is we are all literally living at work, and people are having a hard time separating that. So we finally have a piece of tangible data that supports what some of us in our gut have been feeling for a long time. And so now we're trying to figure out how to mitigate that. But that's the first time we've had real data to bring that home for us.
Well, thank you for Kelli. Did you have a point?
No,
Okay.
please.
So this is such a critical issue that you guys are adding to our conversation, by the way, as we're working to develop students, which is, okay, if we put too much emphasis on being data-driven in everything we do, and you run into a situation where there's no data, what you end up with is analysis paralysis, or just paralysis. There's nothing really to analyze. So you're taking what data you have, and you're spinning your wheels. And so what I am hearing from you is the way forward in a situation like that is to do as much analysis as you can, but then go back on things like what Eric, you called your sort of cultural resources and your values and your, who are we? And that provides the compass.
I think another really interesting phenomenon in 2020, and it started well before 2020, but certainly accelerated, is this whole redefinition of what is the role of the corporation within our ability to deliver against those values. And to be faced with a event like the pandemic, to then be compounded with the very rapid shift in what is the role of the corporation, was a fascinating year in terms of asking ourselves, what do we believe to be important and how do we act against those values?
So just before we leave this question, let me just build a little bit on that, Rob, because you mentioned sort of this ongoing debate that was going on before COVID, and COVID may have sort of accelerated it, or at least changed the trajectory of it, about the purpose of the corporation and about what we should be doing. Larry Fink's letters obviously set off a lot of this conversation about corporations having a purpose, and the Business Roundtable statement about broadening what we mean by stakeholders, not just focusing on shareholders. And I wonder if how those sorts of conversations have played into these things that we're talking about making decisions during, before, or after COVID. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I can share with you from our perspective, we made a very conscious choice to deprioritize shareholders in 2020. We just said we were not going to worry about what our shareholder returns were. We were going to protect our employees, we were going to serve our communities, and we were going to manage through whatever liquidity challenges could come out of what at that time appeared to be a collapsing banking system. So those were the first three priorities we set, and we said, there will be a time when we return to shareholder primacy, but it's not now, and it's not going to be until we're through this crisis.
Now, was that decision because we think that's going to be better for the long-term health of the company, or because it's the right thing to do, or some combination of the two?
Well, all of the above. I think that, and it's harder to look at in retrospect, but I remember in March of last year thinking that we could be facing a financial crisis that would eclipse what had happened in 08, 09, and that everybody was drawing down revolvers, and we were managing to make sure we had cash for an economy that was going to go down by 30, 40, 50%. So I think we had a situation in March, April, where it appeared as an existential threat, which I think, give the Fed and some of the government reaction their due. I think the rapidity with which they responded took that degree of risk down very rapidly. But our first focus was, take away when I went to college, and the first question was, what's the purpose of the corporation? Is to maximize shareholder value, full stop. There was nothing else. And I think what this crisis did was force us to recognize, as had been developing, that there is a broader stakeholder constituency to which we are responsible.
Any others have experiences related to that broader debate?
Well, I think one of the things that we're sort of talking a little bit around, but not attacking head on, is, post the tragic events of George Floyd's death and murder, it was really thrust into the spotlight, how are corporations going to respond? What is our role on these broader social issues, just as an entity? Because the data that we've seen from some outside consulting firms that we've looked at is, when you look at trust that people have in different sources of information, political sources are the lowest, news media is the next lowest. The one area that's held up pretty well is the company. So people still generally trust and believe what their businesses are telling them, the people that they work for. So it's incumbent on us as leaders in that environment to make sure that we're, again, being very fact-based, being very truthful with ourselves, and again, not to overuse the word that Andrew brought up at the beginning, but to be authentic to who we are as a company, and to share that information, and to take a stand appropriately, and really explain to people why we're doing it and how it ties back to the original values that I outlined for our firm. That doesn't come easy, and you're never going to get everybody to completely agree with whatever you're saying, but if they believe that you're doing it for the right reasons, and you take the intent out of it, it becomes a much more manageable, and in some cases really productive conversation. But they're hard. They're really hard.
Yeah, these
I
are
can-
tough issues.
I
Kelly.
can add to that. I think the key piece of this is that today's young people, the young adults, are really going to push us on this because they want alignment with their values. They want that alignment in where they spend their money, where they spend their time. And so our ability to attract them to work with and for us for meaning our organizations, but with us is I think going to in part hinge on our ability to reflect the values that they think are important. They have to align with what we think is important as well. But in order to, to get the talent that we're going to need in order to take our organizations to the next level, we've got to make sure that we are creating that alignment for the right people that we want to work for us. And I think that's part of what we saw last summer was that young people are out there talking about what they value. And we already knew one of the things that I've learned in the last 10 years or so is, how younger people, younger adults value their time and where they spend their money. And last year, what we saw is kind of their social values. And I think that just gives us a sense as leaders where we're going to have to go over the next 10, 15 years as we look to pull those folks into the places that we are today, frankly. And they take the reins and move our organizations forward. So.
Excellent. Very good. Well, that question took us in some interesting directions. Let me ask another question here. This is one that I had sent to all of you before. I'd be interested to hear from you about what are some of your leadership mentors or role models and how they helped you, because obviously, not obviously, hopefully, we at Olin helped to provide some foundation, but I'm sure that there were mentors and role models along the way who were absolutely critical in helping you become who you were. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on who those people were and how they helped you along the way. So Rob, how about you?
Well, that's a really easy one for me. When I was about 30 years old, I had the opportunity to meet Bill Stieritz, who at the time, I think was actually a member of the board of trustees at WashU. He had been the CEO of Ralston Purina, and for whatever reason, he took an interest in me, and we formed a partnership over the next 10 or 15 years that ultimately led to him recruiting me to run Post. And virtually everything I've learned about running a public company and capital allocation comes from Bill. So I've had a very defining mentor for 25 plus years.
Oh, that's powerful. Andrew?
So I'm stealing a little bit of thunder from my video that you guys may end up using. I know we were supposed to do this last year in person, and I had asked the person who's been the defining mentor, certainly in my Illumio career, which is a big part of my professional life, George Tennant, who some of you will recognize the name because he was director of Central Intelligence for many years, and prior to that was in government for even longer. But for the last decade or so, he's been the chairman of a firm in New York called Allen and Company. And he's not only one of my closest friends, but he is categorically the most important professional mentor in my life. And it's not because of anything having to do with the day-to-day job or what we choose to invest in or not. It's because I can pick up the phone, and in a way that Rob sort of described partnership, I can pick up the phone and I can call him and ask him about anything. And most of the time it's organizational issues, it's people issues. It's the things that unfortunately there really isn't a training book for. And I say this all the time. Every day I get up and go to work. Illumio is growing. We're hiring a few more people. Every day I have the biggest job that I've ever had in my entire life, presuming the company continues to grow. And so having somebody that's been there, done that, seen it, that you can just pick up the phone and with no judgment, with nothing other than your best interests at heart, it's incredible. And so it is a partnership. It's become an incredibly important friendship in the process, but he's been a real guiding post for me.
Oh, great. Eric, how about you?
I'm going to actually take this answer in a little bit of a different direction because, as an investor, we believe in sort of a mosaic theory. You're looking for little tiles to fill in the big picture. And when I reflected on this question, there have been a lot of people that have helped me along the way and that have given me a boost. And, some of them came through WashU, professors there. But honestly, it's been a lot of little things. But when I really reflected on this, at the risk of turning this into like a sappy Academy Awards moment, I'm really lucky in that I have two parents, one of whom my father was an NSA code breaker, very quantitatively based person, but my mother was a hospice nurse, incredibly empathetic person. And I feel like, those are both important skills to have. And I got, by the, genetic lottery, a good blend of the two of those. And then, as going back to just trying to be a very good leader, if you don't know what you believe, then it's really hard to lead people. And so I've really tried to just spend a lot of time learning from people how to just establish my own core beliefs, and then they kind of come out, and then you're able to lead successfully. And so looking at people who are able to just be themselves and how they're able to do that doesn't mean you have to be like them, but to understand how they do it has been a really strong part of my development.
Thank you. Kelli.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on Eric's theme around the mosaic, again, as an investor, and I relate to that completely. For me, it's a lot of people, honestly. I think I'm a person of faith, and I owe that to my paternal grandmother, who really was the one that instilled that in me very, very early on. And then above and beyond that, WashU definitely has a lot of threads. I think about my first full-time boss, who his name is Peter Lewis, and he is a Olin alum as well. And he taught me two things. He said, you'll never have enough time to get all the information that you think you need. He said, so you'll run out of time before you run out of things to do. So that was the one big thing that he taught me, and that rolls in my head literally every day. And then the second thing he taught me was around editing and writing, and how to craft a story around an investment opportunity as an analyst, as we write memos about investment opportunities. And that's been honed over the years, but he was the first one to really teach me how to write memos. And so he's one of the people that stands out. And then again, to Andrew's point, some of what you'll hear this evening, the other two people who have been critical to me have been Bob Virgil, the former dean of the Olin School, and Larry Thomas, who was my scholarship sponsor while I was at WashU. And I could go on and on. There are tons of people, and now I feel bad because I'm naming names, and I didn't really intend to do that, because that could go on and on. But yeah, the mosaic theory is absolutely applicable in my life as well. So.
Well, thank you. And I think hopefully a message for anybody that's watching this is that here we're celebrating your career achievements, and I think it's always valuable to step back and say, okay, none of us got there alone, and there were people who made it possible for us to be where we are, and it's very clear in your stories that was the case. Okay, well, here's the last question that I'd like to ask each of you, and then we'll open up for questions from those that are participating remotely. I guess we're all participating remotely, those who are viewing. And that is, so I'd like you to sort of think back and imagine that you are watching this as an Olin student, and you're looking at people who are 20 years out, 30 years out, and who have had the kind of success that you aspire to have, that led you to get a degree at the Olin Business School. What do you wish you had heard, or you had heard from those people if you were sitting in the audience and projecting ahead? So this is kind of an opportunity to give advice, but put yourself in the shoes of those who want to be you. What would you tell them? Kelli, would you like to start that?
Yeah, as I thought about this question, I came up with kind of 3 quick bullet points. One is take chances, and especially the chances that make you uncomfortable. That's something it's taken me a while to get to the point where I feel like I'm pushing myself to do that. But the things that make you a little uncomfortable, whether it's having that conversation with someone at the table, or joining a new group, or whatever it is, take those chances. Ask more questions. Sometimes, and this is especially for the women that are out there watching, sometimes I think as women, we feel as if we can't kind of put our hands up and ask the questions, but it's important that you do that. So ask those questions. And in that same vein, be assertive, not rude, but be assertive. And be polite with it, and people will appreciate it. I tell young people all the time, feel free to reach out to me, and forgive me if I don't respond immediately. I won't be offended if you end up sending me 3 more emails, as long as you're polite about it. So be assertive and go after the things that you want. So that would be my 3 bullet points for everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Andrew.
Sorry, I had to unmute, which I'm sure everybody's very used to nowadays. Yeah, it's interesting. I would say figure out what you love doing and be brutal in the analysis of that, but don't equate it to a job necessarily early on. In other words, there is a big difference in what you love and then figuring out what role, job, or company you're going to instantiate it in. I love relationships. I love people. I love selling things. It happens to be software. But figure that nugget out, because it turns out that what you love is probably what you're good at. It's certainly what you'll enjoy doing most. And in a lot of ways, that's something that I wish I had thought more about early on. What is it that I really want to do? What is it that I really enjoy doing, where I'll be excited to do it every day when I wake up in the morning? And then, yes, you do have to operationalize it and figure out where to go do it and get a job and figure out how to turn it into a career. But it does start with what you really enjoy and what you're passionate about. And I would tell myself that 20 years earlier, figure that out as early as possible.
That's great. Thank you. Rob, how about you?
Well, first, I would strongly agree with both Andrew and Kelli. I think those are great comments. To those, I think I would add maybe 3. One, that it's hard to accept at that point in life that it's a marathon, not a sprint. You really want to get out there fast and become successful. And, many of the people that are most successful later were not the most successful early, and it really is a long game. 2, something that can be hard to accept is that to any career, there is a certain element of luck, and that you ought not to judge your self-worth by, every aspect along the way in your career, because there are elements of both good and bad luck that will come your way, and how you manage through those is as important as anything. And then 3rd, I would tell people, don't take a path simply for money. Let the money be a byproduct of the success, not the focus of the success.
Excellent. And finally, Eric.
This is the worst one to go last on, by the way. It's like, come on. Those are all really, really good. So I also wrote down 3 things, and they've actually all been said in slightly different but very similar ways. The first thing that I had written down on this one is, understanding that in the end, to Andrew's point, we're all at some point in our career selling something, whether you are an investment analyst trying to sell a portfolio manager on an idea, whether you're directly in sales, whether you're Rob trying to sell a bank on, extending your revolver, whatever it is, you're selling something. And to be successful at that, you've got to believe it yourself. And so that gets to Andrew's point of figure out what you truly believe was the first thing. The second point that I had written down was, and this gets very close to what Rob just said about money, is it's much more important to really judge who you're working with versus where you're working, because the people you interact with at your office every day are going to be the ones that really influence you and help you have satisfaction and happiness. And so, choosing who you work with really, really matters, more so than just the logo on, the wall of the building. And then the last one I'd written down ties directly into what Kelli had said, which is, take some initiative. It's even if it's not perfect, especially if it's, something that's a little bit out of your comfort zone, people in leadership positions reward those who are willing to go out on a limb and take an initiative. And we don't expect everything to be perfect. That gives us a chance to work together and to develop you. So, I think everybody here said all of those.
Stuart, can I add one more?
Yes, please.
Be prepared to fail and be prepared to get up afterwards. I've had major failures, things that at the time I thought I could never recover from. And here I am today. And again, I'm a person of faith, so I do believe that some of that comes from a higher power, but some of it is just my willingness to get up and shake it off and take that next step forward. And so be prepared for that. And I'm sure everyone else here could tell a similar story. So that's the key thing. Just be prepared for that. It'll come and you will be fine afterwards. Trust me.
So glad you added that one. That's really important. And by the way, all of these are just solid gold. Wonderful, wonderful suggestions. And I hope those listening are taking notes. Okay, we do have a few questions and I want to make sure we get to those. So this first one, and these are just for anybody who wants to weigh in. This first one is a very pragmatic one. Outside of your primary area of focus at Olin, what courses or subject areas proved invaluable to you in your career?
I'll go first.
I'll go first on that one, Stuart. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead,
Kelli.
Eric, please, go ahead.
So the wall behind me, most of those degrees are my wife's, who's also a WashU graduate. She got her PhD in clinical neuropsychology, and I spent a lot of time hanging around with her psychology friends. And I will tell you, I learned a lot from them about how to relate to people and to think about things much broader than just financial statement analysis. So it ties into my point about communication as well. Just spending time with psychology and communication prepares you really well to be a leader.
I think for me, the class that outside of Olin that I enjoyed the most actually was my constitutional law class, which was taught by Professor Lee Epstein, who left the university and came back recently. And it just, again, and so much of what we do in investing ties in with politics and geopolitics. And so that was by far one of the best classes that I had outside of Olin. So
I would say, I think it was in Olin, but I would say statistics, because I think understanding the nature of uncertainty and learning to make judgments within the practical limits and the implications thereof, I think was a pretty profound reaction to that class.
That's great. Back to the data-driven. Andrew, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I had a class, actually, it was my freshman year, and unfortunately it was at the opposite end of campus. I lived on the 40 and it was all the way over near Brookings, and that walk got very, very cold because it was at 8 a.m. So I do remember it well, but it was the business of medicine. And even though I've never done anything with it specifically in my career, for whatever reason, it stands out very dramatically because it was a topic that I knew nothing about. I only know what I learned in that class, but I was fascinated by it. It opened up sort of my aperture to a part of the world that I never really thought about. And for whatever reason, it just stands out as something really interesting and sort of reminded me that you don't necessarily need to spend your time on your day job every day.
Excellent. No, these are great. So I think you've helped people plan their next semester schedule here.
That memory does stand out, walking from one end of campus to the other as it got colder and colder over that first semester.
Right. That's good. In other words, take it in the spring. Is that the moral there?
It feels like it ends better than it starts if you do it in the spring.
Okay, well, here's another question. And I think this builds on the question that we discussed earlier about mentors. So the question is, how did you connect with your mentors? Did it just happen? Did your work bring them to you, or did you plan the connections? It is clear that this is so impactful to many of us. So they're wondering, how do you find these mentors? So anyone want to take that one on?
Happy to throw one thing out there, and it's basically stealing Kelly's line from earlier, which is don't be shy. Just talk to people. Don't worry about where it leads. Don't have an agenda every time you start a conversation. I've been in large crowds where I end up meeting one person out of hundreds of people who has become either a close friend or a close mentor. Just talk and be open and be authentic, to use a word that's getting a lot of airtime, but rightfully so. And you never know where it's going to lead, but occasionally you'll be very surprised by it. It's the lack of strategy.
And I think when it comes to networking, it almost has to be a lack of, you can't be fully, you don't know who you might end up needing in your career. So that's really, really important. And I love that, by the way. And I hope this younger students are listening to that, because oftentimes we, maybe not during COVID, but in the business school, we create a lot of opportunities for people to get to know one another in the form of receptions and gatherings, and not everyone takes advantage of that. And I think Andrew's point is really suggesting that those may be critical, more critical than you can imagine in the trajectory of your career. So got to put a plug in for that. Others?
Most of mine came just indirectly related to work, but by chance. Bringing up Bob again, when I told Bob I wanted to make a shift to work in endowment management, he introduced me to one person who introduced me to someone else who has now become a lifelong mentor, Margaret Chen. And I worked with Margaret for years. Now she's definitely one of my go-to people when I need advice or need to bounce ideas or I'm struggling with something, all because of Bob. And again, as I said, I trace so much of where I am today back to WashU and to Olin specifically. So I think it's around those, that willingness of making those connections with people, and then building a relationship with them such that when you do want or need advice, they're willing and able to make an introduction for you. Not that you're looking for that per se. I wasn't looking for Bob to do that. I was just looking for some advice. And then he introduced me to someone who also has become a lifelong mentor. So that's just, for me, that's how it has happened.
Thank you. Rob, Eric, any thoughts on that? How you connect? And
Mine was very much by chance. I knew a guy who introduced me to Bill, and I followed up on that. And that's, one of the elements I meant about luck. And obviously you have to optimize that luck, but it was very much by chance.
Yeah, I think they've all said it well, Stuart. So
yeah, no, that's great. So yeah, that's, by the way, Rob, I thought you added that point earlier about luck, and I think that's very, very well taken. I'm glad you added that, because we call it luck, but here's an example of how you kind of create your luck, right? I mean, Andrew said you talk to people. Luck is being in the right place at the right time. Well, the more effortful you are, the more mindful you are about being in places at times, the more likely it will be that you'll be at the right place at the right time to find somebody, meet somebody, make a connection, open a door.
Yeah, one of the bigger coincidences in life is that the harder you work, the luckier you become.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if you're sitting there hoping to get lucky, but you're not going, not reaching out, not talking, not leaning in, as you guys have been saying so well, it's not going to happen. Well, anyway, these are great, but we're out of time. And so let me thank you so much for taking this morning, taking some time to reflect on your journeys. As I said at the beginning, our goal here was simply to take you, some of our wonderful examples of successful alums who've done great things with your careers, and invite you to reflect on some of the lessons that you've learned in the journey. And this has been exactly what I had hoped, and I hope those who attended were able to learn some things that will be helpful for you. Let me just, in conclusion, congratulate you again, each of you, for being recognized as distinguished alums, and hope that the relationship with Olin continues. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.